As I had forsaken the priests, so I left the separate preachers also, and those called the most experienced people. For I saw that there was none among them that could speak to my condition. And when all my hopes in them and in all men were gone, so that I had nothing outwardly to help me, nor could tell what to do, then, oh then, I heard a voice which said, There is one, even Christ Jesus, that can speak to thy condition. And when I heard it, my heart did leap for joy. This quote was taken from the Journal of George Fox.
Welcome, everyone. This is the Ohio Yearly Meeting Conservative Presentation and Study of William Shewen's The True Christian's Faith and Experience. This is session number 6. We have completed reading the 3 different prefaces to this work last week, and today we will begin the first section of 20 sections that are the main bulk of the text. What I ordinarily do is I will read the text, but I'm reading it into a modern translation that I'm translating as we go along to make it a bit easier to understand what is there in the actual text that William Shewen wrote in 1675. We have finished the 3 prefaces, and now we are on page 25 of this modern 2007 text. This is the true Christian's faith and experience declared concerning God, Christ, the Spirit, etc. This first section is concerning God. The second and third sections concern Christ, and then the Holy Spirit, and then the fourth section is repentance. So it goes on from there. We start with the very basics at the beginning. God is infinite and incomprehensible in himself, and all the words of men and angels cannot define him as he is, being in all, through all, and above all. One comment here is throughout this whole work, as I've said before, almost every line has some kind of reference to the Bible. When I'm hearing in all, through all, and above all, I'm thinking immediately of the book of Acts, where you find those words. And it's the same throughout. I may point out some of these as we go along, but I could say that every other sentence is like this. One other thing I think I should say right now is throughout all the coming sections, what is typical is that the first part of each section will be devoted to what the true Christian believes and how he acts, what he experiences. And then the second half is what the nominal, or he often uses the word titular Christian, the Christian name only, believes, and how he acts and what he experiences. That's going to be throughout all 20 sections here. Let's continue. And the various names given him, God, throughout the Holy Scriptures were according to the manifestation or appearance and operation of God's Spirit in their hearts, those people that wrote them, and according to the state it found them in when it appeared to them. Hence, God is called a consuming fire. This sentence we just read about the ways that God is expressed in the Scriptures will vary depending on how that individual writer of that book, that epistle, that letter, what they were experiencing and how they experienced God at that moment that led them to write what they wrote. Our God is a consuming fire, and his word like a hammer and like a fire, and a jealous and angry God who, like a devouring fire, goes through briars and thorns and consumes them. And the day of his appearance among these briars and thorns, thistles and stubble, is compared to the burning of fire in an oven, in which the wicked cannot dwell. When I read here briars and thorns, I'm thinking of that important parable that you find in the first 3 Gospels about the sower of the seed. If you recall, in one of the types of ground that the seed of God, the word of God, had fallen on, those thorns and briars, bristles, what's being referred to here is that those are the kinds of things that are consumed by God, that they no longer will exist. Prior to that, we have this expression, God is a jealous and angry God. It's important to remember that in the Old Testament, it says this because God will have no other gods beside him. There is only one God, regardless of how many gods or items and things that people treat as gods. He is the only God, regardless of whatever we worship as a God. No, there is just one God. Any comments?
I think it's important maybe to note that jealousy is not envy. The meanings of the two words have been conflated these days. So God's not envious of our success or our joy or our happiness.
No.
Jealousy connotates that he wants to keep to himself what is rightfully his. Just like you want to keep your wife sexually to yourself, you don't want to share her. That's not a bad thing, that's a good thing.
That is the true meaning of in older English. The word jealous is also related to zealous. They both go back, I believe, to the same original Greek word. Chad just said correctly what I understand of this word as it's being used here.
And it'd be for our good that he want to keep him to himself so that we're not subjected to false gods and the sorrows that come from that.
We continue here. And others could call him by quite contrary names, specifically according to the operation of his spirit in them. And by it, they could say that God is love, and his word was like milk. God's expressing himself was like milk, and sweeter than honey or the honeycomb, and that the light of his face was better than the increase of grain, wine, and oil, and that he was a shield and a shadow of a rock in a weary land. A rock here in the sense of a rock like the Rock of Gibraltar. We're talking about a big rock formation that can produce a shadow. And his name, like a strong tower, his nature, his basic essence, his nature, and like a safe dwelling place, and like a precious ointment poured forth. I'm going to just stop there. As you see here, we have a completely different understanding here, or I should say, experience of God, how God is operating on someone, telling them they're doing something wrong. Or on the other hand, God is being experienced as love because they are in touch with that sacred essence that is God. Any comments so far?
God knows our needs. It's not that he is kinder to somebody else than us, but he knows what we need at any particular time to bring us to him.
Right. We'll talk about how that can change, that the first appearance of God may be more like this consuming fire, but then later it will change into an experience of love as we follow and obey God. And that's not just what Shewen here is saying. This is said by other early Quakers as well. Actually, everything we've read so far, you can find in other early Quaker writings. Okay, and his face of presence, glory and power, which is terrible to the worker of iniquity, is pleasant and desirable by those that witness Zion's redemption, the liberation of Zion, Jerusalem, by the spirit of judgment and burning from iniquity. So as I was just saying a minute ago, this can turn into something pleasant and desirable after the judgment and burning away of that is iniquity, that is not in alignment with God's will. Redemption so often means liberation. And Zion, well, if you recall, Moses redeemed the Jewish people out of Israel. He liberated them. Mount Zion is Jerusalem, where Jerusalem is. He's talking about the liberation of Zion in terms of a Jewish sense from Egypt, but also we'll find out later from other things. These things are known now as in former ages. The same ark troubled and plagued the Philistines was the glory of Israel. The same hand and power that smites, that hits and destroys the Egyptian, saves and delivers the Israelite. The same spirit of truth that reproves, that rebukes the world regarding sin, is the comforter of those that are made free by it from sin or from sinning. The same breath that breathed life in the beginning before sin entered kindles the fire that torments the wicked. Here's an expression that you'll find so often in Shewen: he that can understand, let him. It's an interesting perspective on God, but I think it's an important one to understand how God is experienced and how it can change from something that seems terrible to something that is loving. Comments?
I would say from my experience that if I'm walking in the Spirit, then his corrections are quite welcome. I would appreciate any upgrade he would suggest or command because it's a better way. But if I'm in the flesh and walking in the flesh and depending on the flesh, then it would probably feel like death to me and quite painful. And I'm quite confused sometimes when I hear believers speak about how painful correction is. And it's like, well, if you focus on the Spirit and let the light lift you over the darkness, it doesn't seem very painful at all. Like David, we could pray, search me and try me if there's any wicked way within me, because we're looking for God's upgrades. We want them. We want to walk in a way of love that is more in accord with the Spirit of God.
So often in the writings of earlier friends, traditional friends, it is said the first appearance of Christ is that of light, the light of Christ. And that light is an illuminator, an illumination of all the dark side in us, all the sinfulness, all the failing, all the negative side. And that can be a very hard time. But of course, if you then continue following what that light is showing, it turns into a much more warm, loving kind of understanding. If you are listening to it and obeying it, more light will be given, but it will be a very different experience than what it might have been originally. That original experience is what friends called convincement. Convincement in earlier English meant being found guilty. Being convinced was convicted. It's the same root as convict, and that's what it most often meant. It also meant persuade, but it had this other sense we don't use at all in modern English in terms of being convinced or convincement. And that's very important because you lose something that is there in terms of the light of Christ, that illumination, that grace of God, that favor of God, really wanting to get you to change, to go through a major heart transformation. Metanoia is the Greek word, to really become closer to God with his help. That is possible, but it might seem difficult at first. Comments?
I was thinking of the 23rd Psalm, the portion that says, "Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me." These are instruments the shepherd uses for correction.
Yes, that's hard for many people today, I think, in our society, modern society. We don't like someone else telling us what's wrong, but we can't change and become better unless we know what's wrong. And if anyone can tell us what's wrong better, I think we can say it would be God. Okay, the true Christian believes there is one God who is a spirit, pure in essence, omnipresent in being, incomprehensible and almighty in power. This word spirit is very important, I think, in this sentence, because what we're saying is that God is not a material, physical thing. The word spirit, in Latin spiritus, is a translation of the Greek pneuma. Pneuma, P-N-E-U-M-A, means something physical. It means breath or wind. But when you're thinking of it non-physically, it's spirit. So here, who is a spirit? I think we need to keep that in mind. Omnipresent means he is everywhere. There's nowhere in creation, in the universe, that is devoid of God. And of course, almighty in power, God is power, absolute total power, creative power, sustaining power. That's, I think, pretty obvious. So he goes on to talk about the true Christian. The true Christian demonstrates his faith and experience in this manner. He has received a manifestation of him in his own heart, mind, and spirit. And so he has come to know him pure and omnipresent by his work in operation there. He can say that God is pure, truly, of a truth, because he finds his appearance so pure and holy in his heart that it will not allow or permit so much as a vain and empty thought to lodge there, or any unclean thing to be touched. So we're talking here about a real experience of God in some way. Maybe it's just a small degree at first, but there's a feeling that there's a manifestation of him in our own heart. A heart often means consciousness or conscience. We are conscious of God in some way, in our mind, in our spirit, and we really feel that is God, and that God is so pure. It's very apparent here in what he's saying. And this true Christian is a true witness of the truth of those scriptures, Habakkuk 1:13, Jeremiah 17:10, and 15:19, which says that God is of purer eyes than to behold iniquity, and that he examines the heart, the conscience, the consciousness, and he tests the reins and divides between the precious and the vile, between thought and thought, word and word, work and work, that is, action and action. And further, he is a true witness that God is almighty in power, because he has, by his mighty power, broken down those strongholds formerly built in one's heart by the enemy of one's soul, that is, the devil. He has cast down imaginings, every high thing that exalts itself against the knowledge of God, against the experience of God, bringing into captivity every thought into the obedience of Christ. All of this is from the epistles of Paul.
Could you tell us what it means? He tests the reins?
I've seen this so often, I don't know what that specifically means. I'm wondering if it means like where God puts us to the test at times.
And I think that the reins, the kidneys, was another place where people thought that emotions were felt. Talk about people having these feelings in their bowels and in their reins and so on. That's how I interpreted that.
Oh, okay. Yeah, because the word bowel in earlier English meant emotion, feeling. We talk about gut feelings. That's the same understanding. You got a feeling in your gut feelings. There's also the verse in the Lord's Prayer where there's a request. It's unfortunately mistranslated in most translations that people know, and that is, lead us not into temptation. Well, that's an incorrect translation of that verse. It's, may you not bring us to a time of trial, to a time of testing, but on the contrary, rescue us from evil, or rescue us from the evil one. So the ordinary translation most people know is, lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. But it's better translated as, may you not. It's in the subjunctive there in the Greek. May you not bring us to a time of testing. That word, for a period or a time of testing or trial, also means temptation. But it doesn't make any sense because God doesn't want to tempt people. But the request here in the Lord's Prayer is, please don't put us to the test. It's tough. But on the contrary, rescue us from the evil one, rescue us from the devil, from Satan. That makes so much more sense.
The reference, Henry, that I saw, that says, where it's mentioned, says the reins and the heart are often mentioned together in the Psalms and Jeremiah as the whole moral constitution of a man.
Oh, okay. That's interesting. Thanks.
Henry,
Yes.
I think trying the reins is referring to when you're riding a horse and you have the bridle, the rider controls the horse by the reins. So if you pull back, the horse needs to stop. And if the horse is broke to neck reining, you move the reins to one side, the horse turns that way, or the other side, the horse turns this way. So I see this as God seeing just how responsive we are to his voice.
Well, the word try, or here trieth, often meant test. I think that makes good sense, Ellis. Basically dividing between the precious and the vile, between thought and thought, so that we get a clearer understanding of what our thoughts are, whether they are precious or vile, whether our words are precious or vile, whether the actions, our acts are precious or vile. That's the examination. Search often means examine. He searcheth the heart. He examines the heart, that basic fundamental essence of us, what we are conscious of.
I also like that he says, how can you be a witness of anything if you haven't experienced it? So you have to see, hear, or sense God in order to be a true witness of God and who he really is.
Yes, that's the true Christian, right?
Otherwise, it's just book learning of what somebody told you, which he gets into later.
Right. That's the other, the titular Christian, the nominal Christian.
And so I would say, how can you follow someone you don't know, you don't see, and you don't sense in some way?
Well, he'll explain how that's done by the Christian name only. We're almost there. Okay. And he knoweth. And he knows the dark mountains at which his feet stumbled, removed, and the rocks broken, and the raging wave stilled, and that tongue in nature bridled which no man could tame. But before this is witnessed, he has known him, God, to sit as a refiner's fire and fuller's soap, and as a spirit of judgment and burning. We've just heard that earlier. And so he became a living witness of what he has seen, felt, heard, and understood by the mighty working of his Holy Spirit in his mortal body. So what Shewen is saying is that the true Christian has really, to various extents, but really experienced some of this in himself. And he's going to go on now in the rest of this section to talk about the Christian in name only, what he understands. And of course, he saw himself as a Christian in name only at one time earlier. The titular Christian, the Christian in name only, says he believes in one God who is pure, omnipresent, and almighty. Take his word, and there is no difference. But how does he demonstrate his faith that to him there is just one God? Why, he has heard a relation, a narrative about him, his oneness, his purity, and almightiness in the Holy Scriptures. And he has been educated and trained up in the traditions of his forefathers. And so his knowledge of God, he professes, is acquired from them. He has read in some book, or somebody has told him that God is one, pure, omnipresent, and almighty. And he grounds his faith and knowledge upon this tradition and history. And he professes God and his attributes in words. But he is not a living witness of God within himself. Stop there. This is what we've just been talking about. There is a difference between knowing these things academically or verbally, outwardly, but experiencing them is something else.
I am very disappointed in the number of schools where the administration, none of them have ever been in front of a classroom to teach. They have only acquired their administrative credential and then moved directly from that in university into their position. They do not bring with them the understanding of what it's like to stand before a bunch of kids and try to help them understand something new. I guess I'm relating to that in the same way that Shewen is just saying. If you don't know it, there's no way you can really appreciate it nor do it.
Yeah. Over and over again, you read in the writings of early friends the difference between professing God and possessing God. There's a difference between what one professes and what one actually possesses. Those two words occur again and again, and they will occur again and again here in Shewen's work, as well as all the other early friends' works and later. It's the difference between saying one thing and actually experiencing it. The experience is so important, so critical, vital.
And we could say that the experience is vital because it actually transforms us, whereas the intellectual understanding and assent does not transform the heart.
That's correct. That's correct. It might lead that for some people. I mean,
if it leads to experience, yes.
If it leads to experience, right. That's what I was just going to say. So let's continue. And so, notwithstanding the nominal Christian professors one God, he lived in the world which has many gods, we would put that with a small g today, and worships and falls down before them. And the next verse is one of my favorite in Shewen. Every beloved lust, every beloved craving obeyed is a god. Every beloved craving, strong desire, when it's obeyed, is a god to us. That's important. As we said earlier, God is a jealous and angry God. He's not going to allow any other gods besides himself. There's only one God, one creator, one sustainer, maintainer of the universe. Let the titular, let the nominal Christian profess what he wants to. He that commits sin is the slave of it, and in that he is no believer, worshiper, or knower of the true God, God's purity or almightiness. Again, you can find false Christian ministers who can preach a lot and they've got their Bibles memorized, but if you're sharp enough, you can maybe very quickly hear that there's something missing there, that it's all just words. And that's not what true Christianity is about. This inward change, this inward metanoia, transformation of the heart. Because his heart, that of the nominal Christian, remains corrupt and rocky, and the mountains of darkness and ignorance remain unremoved, and the strongholds of Satan unbroken down, his thought and imaginings unsubjected to the obedience of Christ, his will, tongue, and nature unbridled. The dross, tin, and rubbish remains and is like a grave with a pure metal. What Shewen is about to tell us is a point that is made elsewhere in the New Testament, where separating the pure metal, like silver, from the dross, from the other metal or minerals associated with it. When you go through a refining process, you try to separate the silver from the rest of the minerals. Same with any other type of pure metal or whatever it is that we are trying to extract from the dross, the stuff that's the slag, what we don't want. So that's what he's saying here. For this nominal Christian, his will, his tongue, his nature, that dross, tin, and rubbish still remain and is like a grave for the pure metal. This titular, nominal Christian contents himself to hear or read about God, like a refined fire, and like fuller's soap, and like a spirit of judgment and burning, and of his cleansing and purifying some people in former generations. But he does not love, nor does he care to know him so in himself, but rather he looks down on and hates his pure appearance in him. The first work of God is to convince him, to convict him regarding sin, righteousness, and judgment, which is compared, this first appearance is compared to a little silver among much dross, a little seed among many great ones, and to a little leaven or yeast hidden in 3 measures of meal. All of these go back to the New Testament and the parables of Jesus. Which silver cannot be parted, separated, and enjoyed except through the appearance of God within, like a refiner's fire, to purge away the dross and take away the tin also, which is something like the silver through which the nominal Christian is deceived. I'll stop there for a moment. Comments, questions?
Henry, I appreciated the transparency at last when you said that you felt, as you read Shewen's work, you felt more like a titular Christian than a true Christian. And as I'm listening to what he's saying, I'm realizing that Jesus called us to the process of holiness, which means being constantly aware as we mature in him of the areas which yet need to be cleaned, which need to be removed. That as we become more and more like him, those things which were hidden and not discernible before begin to stand out. In a sense, we are almost all of us in that process of finding and uprooting the titular parts of ourselves and letting him show us where they are, and then letting him, through his power, begin to remove them.
It can be a downer to feel the wind taken out of your sails, that you were something, you thought you were something that you aren't. But you have to start with truth, with what is real. And if that's the stage I or others are at initially, that's where we are. And we need to be honest about that. There's a certain power and integrity that's so important. I think each of us can read these words and feel them, perhaps in a similar way or in different ways, but I think they're important to hear.
I was thinking how if we take on and think that the job is ours to lift us out of, then that could be even a bigger downer because it's beyond us. And if we think we can, then that is also deception. But it's a light that points out the darkness that needs to be addressed at this time. It doesn't address everything maybe at all at once, but we follow his lead instead of asking God to follow our lead in our cleansing even. I think there's 2 tests. I think some people are always doing fruit inspection on themselves and on other people. But the test really is, am I willing to experience God right now? Or how unwilling am I? Because that's a big red flag. And the second thing would be, am I willing to experience how God sees me? And that's a big one too. The more in the spirit again, the less painful it will be. And so if we find ourselves reluctant, unwilling, that we are afraid to see God because we think he's going to be a big fire that burns us, Fox would say, wait in the light. Focus on that of God within you until he lifts you over, which is infinitely less painful than us trying by the flesh to perfect the flesh, as so many religionists try to do, or insist that God follow their plan in cleansing them.
Are we willing to be open to how God is expressing himself to us at a given moment, at an early moment? That's something that we need to really think about. Okay. Neither can the little seed grow up till the rubbish is taken away, and the ground that is cursed removed, and the heart made honest, which is the good ground in which the seed of the kingdom grows to perfection, grows to full development, completion. Again, that's the parable about the sower and the seed. It's such a very basic, very important parable for friends. They really understood how powerful that parable was of Jesus. The seed of God within us, the seed of the kingdom within us. Neither can the little leaven through and leaven the 3 measures of meal, till that is taken away, which prevents and hinders it, namely, unbelief and hardness of heart, stubbornness within us of change. Now, this day of small things, this day of Jacob's troubles, in which he goes through the refiner's fire, this little seed, this little leaven is overlooked, despised, looked down on, and slighted by the titular, the nominal Christian, who, in his own conceit, his own arrogance, egotism, is exalted and puffed up above the pure appearance of God in his heart, which to know and obey is the gate for all true wisdom and knowledge. This is where Shewen was saying the titular Christian hates this light within. He doesn't want to have to change. It's something that he does not see he needs to do. He's okay as he is. His conceit, his egotism, his arrogance, he's exalted and puffed up above the pure appearance of God. However God may appear, it may not be initially the kind of appearance he wants, especially if it's like soap or whatever. But this is the gate to all true wisdom and knowledge, experience. And the nominal Christian has grown so tall, great and wise in his own thoughts and imaginings, that he cannot walk in the straight way or go in at the door of the sheepfold, but rather would like to climb up some other way. So he contents himself with a traditional historical profession of God in words, and he rejects him in works and actions. And all the knowledge and experience he has of God, his purity, oneness, and almightiness, is just like somebody has told him, or as he has in an unsanctified and unprepared heart read in the Holy Scriptures, which knowledge avails nothing except when accompanied with a living experience of the same power, working in the same manner as it did in others mentioned in the Bible in times past who have left their testimonies on record. I'm hoping some of this is clear to you as to what we've read. It might have to be read more than once. There is a growth understood here, a growth in holiness, a growth in wisdom, a growth in all those virtues that are necessary to become closer to God. I think this section clearly points that out. We might stop here. I don't think we have too much time left to begin the next session. So since we're finishing up this first section, we may end here. So I'm just opening it up now to any comments or questions regarding the whole section.
Again, to the person who might feel discouraged by this sounding like a lot of work for them to do, it's really God who does the heavy lifting. It's him who does the cleansing of our hearts and of the ground. It's our part just to bring the ground to him, to behold him, to rest in him, to continue to focus on him, that of God within us. And the light lifts us over the darkness. So to anyone who's feeling discouraged about maybe past performance or current performance, it's really that simple and that difficult. I had a dream a few years back, and I was on a mission from God to rescue this woman. She was sitting in a dungeon up against the wall on the floor. She was chained to the wall, and there was big manacles on her hands and feet, I believe. In the power of God, I pointed at the manacles, and the manacles fell off, and she was freed. So I helped her to her feet, and I said, let's get out of here before your captors come and find out you're escaping. But the lady stopped me from helping her out and said, "Oh, I really wanted to get free myself in my own power." So she went back to the wall and put herself back in the manacles and began hitting them with a rock. She rejected that which God wanted to free her from because she wanted to do it herself in her own power, in her own ego.
Throughout the New Testament, it's made clear that we cannot get closer to God without God's help, without that Spirit of Christ, the Messiah within us, that is there to help us, to be the focus of our worship, to be what we need to obey, what we need to first hear, listen to. If you have ears to hear what's being said. If you can understand what Shewen was saying here, listen to it, follow up on it. I think we all at some point might think we can do a lot of this on our own, but there is that part that we must do on our own. But we must do it understanding that God is so much greater than any of us or any of our individual brains. We need a supernatural kind of being to really bring us to that supernatural spirit.
And in my experience, not contradicting Chad, but adding to it, God will take away from us all those things that we really know we should be rid of, but only when we really want to be rid of them and when we offer them, we let go of them. And to me, that's what the daily cross is, of offering up, handing to God those things that we want him to deliver us from, to take away, instead of clinging to them and complaining when he tries to take them away.
That reminds me what Conrad just said of, it said in Paul and elsewhere, taking up the inward cross is the way to God. And that seems like such a strange thing. Paul himself says he was crucified with Christ. He understands that he needs to go through this inward type of executing that within him that is not in alignment with God. This is the way to God. This is the straight and narrow path. It's not going through and getting into the sheepfold from some other way. As Shewen was trying to point out in reference to the New Testament also, that we would rather do it some easier way. Well, it may not be easy, at least for some of us. It might be much harder than for others. There was a comment in the late 19th century at a yearly meeting, maybe it was the 1887, some woman got up and just felt that everything was lost because basically they were, if not indirectly, I guess at least indirectly, refuting taking up the cross. Any other comments? Well, thank you, everyone. Next time we will go on to the second section on Christ. It gets split the same way, as I said, talking about the true Christian, his beliefs and experiences and actions, and then the titular, those who have the title of being a Christian, but just called Christian, but they're not.
Save the transcript.
All right, and I'm going to stop the recording.
This podcast has been a production of Ohio Yearly Meeting. It was hosted by Henry Jason and edited by Kim Palmer. The introduction and credits were read by Chip Thomas. The quote in our introduction is from the first chapter of George Fox's journal. The version we read from was printed in 1831 by Marcus and Hopper. A link is in the description. We welcome feedback on this and any of our podcast episodes. Please email us at oymconservative@gmail.com.